September 11th, 2001 is a date that forever changed the course of history. On this day, a series of terrorist attacks shocked the world, forcing a re-evaluation of the concepts of security and global politics. What drove a group of radicals to take such a horrific step? What were the true causes and hidden motives behind this sinister plan? Who was behind these attacks, and how did the global community respond to this unprecedented tragedy? Join us as we delve into the details of one of the darkest days in human history and discover how the events of September 11th impacted the future of the world. Chronology of events on September 11th, 2001. September 11th, 2001, in New York City began like any other morning. The city, immersed in the rhythm of a typical business week, awoke to a new day. People hurried to work, children headed to school, and tourists flocked to Manhattan's famous landmarks. Nothing hinted at the impending disaster, and the morning sun bathed the city in light, creating the illusion of an ordinary weekday. At 8:46 a.m., the quiet of this mundane morning was shattered. A passenger plane, American Airlines Flight 11, en route from Boston to Los Angeles, suddenly deviated from its course. This plane, which had been hijacked by terrorists, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. In an instant, the city, the country, and the entire world were plunged into a state of shock and confusion. Television channels began live broadcasts from the scene, and millions of people around the world witnessed the horrifying scene. Just 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, also bound for Los Angeles, crashed into the South Tower. This time, there was no doubt this was a deliberate attack. Panic gripped New York City as its residents struggled to comprehend what was happening, and mass evacuations began in Manhattan. At 9:37 a.m., the horrifying spectacle continued. A third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, flying from Washington to Los Angeles, crashed into the Pentagon, the heart of the U.S. defense system. This strike demonstrated that the attack was not localized but national in scope, and that no one was safe. While the world watched the destruction of the Twin Towers, a fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, bound for San Francisco, deviated from its route. Unlike the other hijacked planes, the passengers aboard Flight 93 realized what was happening and made a heroic decision. They attempted to regain control of the plane, which led to its crash in a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. This act of self-sacrifice prevented another possible attack on a symbolic target, perhaps the Capitol or the White House. The first minutes after the initial strike on the North Tower seemed unreal. Emergency services, police, and firefighters responded immediately to the crisis, but no one could have anticipated what they were facing. Victims of the attacks tried to evacuate from the burning skyscrapers, but many were trapped above the impact zones. Some, in desperation, began to jump from the windows, choosing instant death over suffering in the flames. Meanwhile, the entire world watched the events unfold live. Television and radio stations interrupted their programs to broadcast information about what was happening. People around the globe were in shock and disbelief at the reality of the situation. New York City, a symbol of global financial power, was attacked at its very heart. By 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed into a heap of rubble. Less than half an hour later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower also collapsed. Two colossal buildings, once symbols of power and prosperity, disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. The panic that gripped Manhattan gradually spread across the country and the world. In New York, thousands of people sought refuge, and emergency services continued their work, risking their lives. The country was plunged into a state of national tragedy, and the world entered a new era where the threat of terrorism became more real than ever before. Causes of the attack: political and ideological. Motivation. The tragic events of September 11, 2001 have their roots in deep political and religious conflicts that intensified throughout the second half of the 20th century. These conflicts became the catalysts for radical ideas and extremist actions, culminating in the attacks on the United States. Osama bin Laden, the leader of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, was a native of Saudi Arabia, a country that is the cradle of Islam and home to the two holiest sites for Muslims, Mecca and Medina. Bin Laden grew up in a wealthy construction magnate's family, which allowed him to receive a good education and become acquainted with Islamic ideas and their radical interpretation. His views were shaped by the ideology of Salafism, a strict and puritanical branch of Islam that advocates a return to the purity of early Islam. In the late 1970s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, bin Laden began actively fighting against the Soviet occupation, organizing and financing the Mujahideen who waged jihad against the communists. This experience of fighting an external enemy, coupled with support from the United States and other Western countries during this period, reinforced his belief in the need to continue jihad now against Western influence in the Islamic world. After the end of the Soviet-Afghan War, bin Laden focused his efforts on fighting the United States, which he saw as the main threat to the Muslim world. He viewed America as the symbol of evil and the source of all the problems facing Muslim countries. In his rhetoric, the United States represented a crusade against Islam, imposing its values, culture, and political institutions on Muslims. Bin Laden believed that the U.S. sought to subjugate the Islamic world, destroy its traditional foundations, and eradicate true faith. Al-Qaeda, as an organization, was formed on ideological principles that included the idea of global jihad, a holy war against infidels. A crucial element of this ideology was the belief that terrorism was a legitimate means of resisting Western oppression. Bin Laden and his followers viewed attacks on civilian targets and mass killings as a way to achieve their political goals, believing that such actions were justified and blessed by Allah. In his 1998 declaration, Fatwa Against Americans, bin Laden proclaimed that killing Americans and their allies, both military and civilian, was the individual duty of every Muslim. In this fatwa, he called on all Muslims to participate in the struggle against the U.S., accusing them of occupying Muslim lands and supporting Israel. An example of Al-Qaeda's ideological motivation was not only the attack on the World Trade Center, but also other assaults, such as the bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 and the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000. These actions were aimed at weakening U.S. influence and forcing them to leave the Middle East. The role of U.S. foreign policy: support for Israel. One of the key factors contributing to the growth of anti-American sentiment in the Islamic world was the United States' support for Israel. Since Israel's founding in 1948, the U.S. has been its main ally and protector on the international stage. This support was expressed through political and military aid, as well as diplomatic protection of Israel in the United Nations and other international institutions. For many Muslims, Israel represents the oppression of the Palestinian people, and its existence on territory considered sacred to Islam is seen as illegal and unjust. In the eyes of radicals, the U.S., by supporting Israel, automatically becomes an enemy of Islam. Bin Laden and his followers repeatedly used this support as an argument to justify terrorist attacks against America. Another significant aspect that provoked resentment and hatred among radicals was the stationing of American military bases in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War of 1990–1991. For Osama bin Laden and many other Muslims, the presence of American troops in the land of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina, was blasphemy. It was perceived as a direct threat to Islam and an invasion of sacred lands by infidels. These bases became a symbol of American imperialism and interference in the internal affairs of Muslim countries. Bin Laden repeatedly stated that this was one of the main reasons for his fight against the U.S., as he saw it as a violation of Muslim laws and a direct threat to the Islamic world. The sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies against Iraq after the Gulf War also played a role in fueling hatred toward America. These sanctions, which lasted throughout the 1990s, led to severe economic and humanitarian consequences for the Iraqi population. Many Muslims perceived this as punishment for an entire nation for the actions of its leader, Saddam Hussein. In al-Qaeda's propaganda, the sanctions against Iraq were often portrayed as an attempt by the West to destroy an Islamic state and subject its people to suffering. This contributed to the growth of sympathy for radical groups and increased their number of supporters, organizers, and perpetrators of the attacks, al-Qaeda and its leaders. The September 11, 2001 attacks were the result of the activities of the international terrorist organization al-Qaeda, which at that time was considered the most powerful and dangerous extremist group in the world. Al-Qaeda was led by Osama bin Laden, a scion of a wealthy Saudi family who had become one of the most wanted terrorists in the world. Osama bin Laden played a key role in shaping al-Qaeda's ideology and strategy. In addition to Osama bin Laden, the organization included other influential leaders who played crucial roles in planning and executing the September 11th attacks. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's closest associate, an Egyptian doctor and ideologist. Al-Zawahiri joined bin Laden after merging his organization, Al-Jihad, with al-Qaeda in 1998. He became one of the group's main strategists and ideologists, responsible for forming a global terrorist network. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the key organizers of the September 11th attacks, who planned and coordinated the operation. He was responsible for recruiting terrorists and developing the details of the attacks. Mohammed proposed the idea of using hijacked planes to attack symbolic targets in the U.S., which became the central part of the plan. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian engineer who led the group of suicide terrorists and became the leader of the so-called Hamburg Cell. He was the pilot of the first plane that crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The preparation for the September 11th attacks was meticulously planned and lasted several years. The terrorists acted with extreme caution and secrecy to avoid detection by intelligence agencies. The primary tool al-Qaeda used in preparing terrorists was training camps located in remote areas of Afghanistan. Here, al-Qaeda recruiters selected candidates who underwent ideological training and physical conditioning. Special attention was given to their commitment to radical ideology and willingness to sacrifice themselves. The 19 terrorists who carried out the September 11th attacks were chosen from among such radicals. Most of them were from Saudi Arabia, a country where the ideas of jihad and radical Salafism had deep roots. The selected candidates received basic skills in secrecy, weapon use, and piloting aircraft. A key stage of preparation was training the terrorists in piloting planes. Al-Qaeda arranged for their transfer to the U.S., where they legally obtained visas and enrolled in flight schools. For example, Mohammed Atta and several other members of the group trained at American flight schools, learning how to operate commercial aircraft. To avoid suspicion, the terrorists behaved like ordinary students, renting apartments, paying for their education, and trying not to attract attention. Strict secrecy was a crucial element of the plan. Members of the group rarely contacted each other, used fake documents, and integrated their actions into everyday life. The targets of the attacks were chosen to symbolize American power and influence: the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and possibly the White House or the Capitol. These locations were carefully studied to ensure maximum impact and to instill fear worldwide. The final months before the attack were devoted to detailed preparation and coordination of actions. The terrorists received necessary instructions and prepared for their final step. The day before the attacks, September 10th, they dispersed 2 different airports to avoid suspicion and ensure synchronization of their actions. On September 11th, the suicide terrorists arrived at the airports, boarded the flights, took control of the planes, and directed them toward pre-selected targets. Their actions were meticulously coordinated, and all 4 attacks took place within a few hours, shocking the world with their brutality and efficiency. These attacks became the most tragic example of how the combination of fanatical ideology, meticulous planning, and willingness to sacrifice oneself for political goals can lead to catastrophic consequences. Consequences of the September 11, 2001 attacks. On September 11, 2001, New York City turned into a disaster zone, the likes of which the city hadn't seen since the Great Depression. The destruction of the World Trade Center created unimaginable scenes of devastation and chaos in Manhattan. The debris of the 2 towers turned into piles of metal, concrete, and glass, burying thousands of people beneath. The city was shrouded in a thick cloud of dust and smoke, and the streets were filled with the injured, disoriented, and terrified people trying to escape. New York's emergency services immediately began responding to the catastrophe. Firefighters, police officers, and medics, many of whom were already on the scene after the first strike, courageously rushed toward the collapsing buildings to save those who might still be alive. They worked under the constant threat of further collapses, risking their lives to save others. Thousands of volunteers, including ordinary citizens, answered the call for help. They provided water, food, and medical supplies and assisted in search and rescue operations, often working long hours without rest. Some of these volunteers came from other states to contribute to saving the victims and clearing the rubble. However, the rescue operations were incredibly complex and dangerous. Many people remained trapped under the debris, but access to them was hampered by the danger of further collapses and fires. Rescuers worked around the clock, hoping to find survivors, but with each passing day, hope dwindled. In total, about 3,000 people perished in the attacks, including rescuers who died during the operations. The September 11th attacks had a colossal impact on global politics and security, triggering a chain reaction of events that shaped international relations for years to come. Immediately after the attacks, the U.S. declared a war on terror, which became a new paradigm for both foreign and domestic policy. The first step in this war was the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. The goal of the operation was to destroy al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban regime, which provided refuge to the terrorists. U.S. troops, along with allies, launched large-scale military operations that lasted more than 2 decades. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, justifying it by claiming that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction and supported terrorist organizations. This invasion became one of the most controversial steps in the war on terror, sparking global debates and criticism. On the domestic front, the U.S. also took drastic measures. The Department of Homeland Security was created, uniting many federal agencies and services to prevent future attacks. Under new laws such as the Patriot Act, the powers of intelligence and law enforcement agencies were significantly expanded, allowing for increased surveillance of citizens and foreigners on U.S. soil. These measures sparked significant debate over the balance between security and civil liberties. Security measures were heightened not only in the U.S. but also worldwide. International airports, transportation hubs, and other potential targets became the focus of increased security measures. Countries began to cooperate closely in exchanging intelligence information to prevent similar attacks in the future. The September 11th attacks left an indelible mark on public consciousness, not only in the US but around the world. This day became a symbol of a new level of threat terrorism capable of striking any country at any time and in any place. People around the world began to realize that they were living in a new reality where security could no longer be taken for granted. Mass culture, media, and educational institutions began actively discussing and analyzing the causes and consequences of these events. Terrorism became a central theme in public discourse, leading to changes in priorities in politics, law, and international relations. Additionally, the perception of Muslims and the Islamic world as a whole changed. In some countries, Islamophobic sentiments began to rise, leading to increased discrimination and attacks on Muslim communities. However, alongside this, efforts began to improve interfaith dialogue and understanding to prevent societal division. The events of September 11th also sparked a new wave of patriotism in the U.S. Numerous memorials, commemorative events, and actions were organized in memory of the victims of the attacks. These events became part of the national identity and a symbol of the resilience of the American people. Thus, the September 11, 2001 attacks changed the world on many levels, from global politics and security to public consciousness and daily life. These changes continue to impact the world even to decades later, reminding us of how one tragic event can alter the course of history. Investigation and punishment of the guilty: the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks, the U.S. immediately launched a massive campaign to find and capture Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, who was identified as the mastermind behind the attacks. This operation became one of the most extensive and long-term counterterrorism campaigns in history. Almost immediately after the attacks, U.S. intelligence determined that al-Qaeda was responsible. Within weeks, President George W. Bush declared Osama bin Laden target number one and vowed that the U.S. would find and punish him for his actions. Soon, a military operation was launched in Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda training camps were located and where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. U.S. forces, supported by allies, quickly overthrew the Taliban regime, which had provided sanctuary to the terrorists. However, bin Laden managed to escape. In the years that followed, he frequently changed his location, hiding in the remote mountainous areas along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The search for bin Laden became a top priority for the CIA and other intelligence agencies, which utilized every available means from satellite surveillance to on-the-ground agents. Despite tremendous efforts, capturing bin Laden in the early years after the attacks proved elusive. However, U.S. intelligence continued to gather information about his movements and hideouts. During this period, the U.S. conducted a global counterterrorism operation, which included arrests and eliminations of al-Qaeda leaders and fighters around the world. A breakthrough came in 2010 when the CIA managed to track a trusted courier of bin Laden. Agents followed his route to a heavily guarded compound in the city of Abbottabad, Pakistan. This house, surrounded by high walls and equipped with advanced security measures, immediately aroused suspicion. For several months, U.S. intelligence monitored the compound, trying to confirm that bin Laden was indeed hiding there. In May 2011, after all doubts were dispelled, President Barack Obama gave the order to conduct the operation. The operation, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, was carried out on May 2, 2011. A team of U.S. Navy SEALs, known as Team 6, infiltrated Pakistani territory using helicopters. Despite some difficulties, one of the helicopters was damaged during landing. The SEALs managed to enter the compound and eliminate bin Laden. The operation took less than 40 minutes, and within hours, bin Laden's body was transported to a U.S. ship, where it was buried at sea in accordance with Muslim traditions. The elimination of Osama bin Laden was a significant milestone in the fight against terrorism. This operation demonstrated that even the most influential terrorists could not escape retribution, regardless of how much time had passed. Despite the elimination of many al-Qaeda leaders, the fight against terrorism has not ended. The U.S. and its allies continue to conduct investigations aimed at preventing new attacks and uncovering networks associated with al-Qaeda. These investigations include both counterterrorism operations and diplomatic efforts to strengthen international cooperation. One of the main lessons learned from the September 11th attacks is the understanding that the threat of terrorism does not disappear with the elimination of one leader or group. It requires constant vigilance, information sharing, and coordinated action at the international level. The events of September 11, 2001 were a turning point in world history. These attacks changed the course of global politics, prompted a reassessment of security issues, and led to a global war on terrorism. The consequences of that day are still felt today, and the memory of the victims of September 11th remains alive in the hearts of millions. It is essential to remember these events to prevent similar tragedies in the future and to build a world based on understanding and respect.